The title of this session is Insights from GAO Audits, the Do's, the Don'ts, and the Future Trends and Mandates in IT Security. Greg is fantastic. The presenter is Greg Wilshusen. He is the Director of Information Security Issues at the GAO. My belief in life, I suppose, is that you only truly grow through the most difficult times in life and learning from the mistakes that you've made. And I think that he'll share with you some of the critical mistakes that have been made by various agencies, and certainly some of the successes as well. And then overall trends to provide you with some insights and lessons learned that you can take back and apply to your agencies. Greg is a cybersecurity expert. He leads the cybersecurity and privacy-related studies and audits of the federal government at the GAO. He has over 30 years of auditing, financial management, and information systems experience. He's a certified public accountant, certified internal accountant, and certified information systems auditor. So please do join me in welcoming Greg.
Thank you, Jessica. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Pardon? It should be on now. Thank you, Jessica. And I guess season's greetings to everyone. As we're starting into the holiday season and everything, I really want to thank Parm and Jessica and Kelly for inviting me here today to talk about information security issues, something I've been devoting my life to for the last, I guess, 20 some odd years. And it's, I think, just as relevant today, if not more so, than it has been over the last decade or so, because there are just so many issues confronting us as we try to protect our systems from various different threats that are growing, evolving, and becoming increasingly more sophisticated. Today, what I'd like to do is, for those of you who don't know, I am from the GAO, and we are part of the legislative branch of government. We're not part of the executive branch. Our main purpose is to help inform the Congress in the discharge of its constitutional responsibilities. But even though we're not part of the executive branch, we do conduct audits and studies and reviews of executive branch activities for the purpose of trying to improve the efficiency and economy of those activities for the benefit of the American people. And that really is what we try to do. And I think we're generally pretty successful at it. But with that, you know, one of the things I wanted to thank Parm about is this particular conference, which I think is really outstanding, is because it does bring a number of thought leaders from across the federal government here, as well as even the business roundtables that we just came from. Really gives me an opportunity as an auditor to be able to keep up on some of the emerging technologies and new tools and techniques that are available to secure these systems. So I think this is just an excellent conference, and I do thank Parm for letting me come here. And this is my second year doing this, and it's just as rewarding as the first. So with that, what I like to do is just kind of go over, as Jessica mentioned, some of the issues that we have identified as part of GAO's reviews. And basically, first just give you a couple very quick snapshots of federal information security, just through a couple of graphs and talking about that, of where it looks like now and also just in the recent past. And then talk about some of the so-called don'ts, some of the frequently identified deficiencies, information security weaknesses that we've identified during our reviews, and then some of the do's, if you will, in terms of recommendations or key security practices that can help agencies secure their systems. And then I know that Earl Crane and others yesterday talked about some of the administration's federal information security priorities. So I'll just briefly touch on that from an audit perspective. And then a couple of the trends that are occurring that will also have impact on how auditors conduct audits. And that's something that we also have to keep up to date in terms of our audit procedures to accommodate changing technologies, business practices, and emerging trends. Then what I'll do is to just briefly go through our portfolio of audits and reviews that we're doing in this fiscal year. There's quite a few of them. And I'll mention too that just about all of our reviews and audits are either statutorily mandated by law or are requested by either a member or members of Congress. And so one thing that one can kind of wean from looking at the type of reviews that GAO is performing in this space is kind of gives an indication of where congressional interests lie. And so that's something that might be a benefit. Then I do provide a list of our recent reports that we issued back in fiscal year 2012. And that too might be a resource for some of you in terms of looking at some of the issues that we've identified and made recommendations on. And then I do plan on leaving some time at the end for questions. But I also tend to be very informal in my presentations. And so what I would really like for you to do, if you have a question during my presentation, by all means, raise your hand and ask the question. Because the main thing I want to do is make sure that I'm meeting your needs in terms of the work that we do at GAO, rather than me just kind of drone on about the stuff we do. So if you have any questions, by all means, ask them during the presentation, or if you prefer to wait till afterwards, that's fine too. So with that, any questions so far? Okay, there's a clue. Okay, apparently not. So moving on. What this shot just shows is basically I wanted to point out that most of the federal agencies in the federal government, and by most, and when we do government-wide reviews, I'm actually talking about the largest 24 major CFO Act agencies. Those are the agencies covered by the Chief Financial Officers Act, and they include all the cabinet-level departments and many of the other major federal agencies. And of the 24, as you can see from this graph, most of them have weaknesses in each of the general control categories that we look at as part of our methodology. And this is as of FISCAM, as it's identified up there, which stands for Federal Information System Controls Audit Manual. It is our methodology for conducting information security control reviews, and it is available on our website. We tend to be pretty transparent in the work that we do, both in terms of methodology as well as the reports. And our reports are also, at least the public version ones, are also available on our website. But in these 5 categories, the first one in which for fiscal year 2011, and that's the most recent data I have now, we're currently in the process of reviewing fiscal year 2012 data that we collected from the IGs. And this is an analysis of the reports that GAO has performed, that the agency IGs have performed, as well as the individual agencies. When they look at their own information security issues, we take that information and then we analyze it and looking for various different weaknesses that have been reported by those sources. And as you can see there, of this, the 23 out of the 24 have issues associated with security management. Now, in the security management field and area, that's basically those types of controls that are identified in processes and techniques that are pretty much identified through FISMA and the elements or components of an agency-wide information security program that FISMA requires each agency to perform. And those include, for example, the procedures for assessing the risk, selecting the appropriate controls that are intended to reduce that risk to an acceptable level and cost effectively reduce that risk, as well as those types of controls which provide computer security awareness training to staff and assuring that those individuals with significant security responsibilities have sufficient and appropriate training. And that's important because many of the issues in this area tend to be root causes for some of the deficiencies that we identify in the other 4 categories. In addition, under security management, we also look at the procedures that agencies take to assess and test the effectiveness of their own security controls. So while many agencies, reluctantly wait for an auditor to come in and review their controls, they also have responsibilities for assessing those controls on an ongoing basis, or at least testing each of the controls under FISMA at least once a year, but based on risk. And then their process and procedures and effectiveness in actually implementing the corrective efforts or techniques to actually mitigate those risks or to accept them. Access controls, which is the second category listed there. Every agency has weaknesses in access controls. And when we conduct our audits, this is the area where we find most of the computer security vulnerabilities. And these include those types of controls that relate to protecting one's boundaries or an organization's boundaries. It also includes those procedures that agencies have to identify and authenticate the identity of their users and their devices that connect to their systems. Relates also to the authorization controls that are involved in terms of assuring that individuals only have the level of access necessary to perform their jobs and in compliance with the principle of least privilege, if you will. And also the encryption, use of encryption to protect sensitive information, audit and monitoring procedures, and also physical security, the controls that they have in place to assure and restrict physical access to the data facilities and information resources. Excuse me. The third area in which, in fiscal year 2011, 22 out of the 24 had weaknesses in was configuration management. And this deals with just assuring that agencies have the procedures for assessing and authorizing and testing software before they put it into their production environment to make sure it's working effectively and is authorized as well as approved. And also their procedures for implementing patches and assuring that that software operating systems are currently supported by their vendors. Segregation of duties relates to the area where an agency restricts access, for example, from developers gaining access to the production environment, where they may have access and capabilities to make unapproved changes to production systems. It's basically assuring that the access permissions and the roles and responsibilities of individuals are appropriately segregated so they can't control all aspects of a particular transaction, process, or so, to where they would be able to conduct inappropriate activities without detection. So segregation of duties pertains to separating those roles and responsibilities among multiple groups so that the groups of one actually act as a control or detection control against the actions of the other group. And then finally, the fifth category that we look at is contingency planning. And Dr. Ross yesterday spent quite a bit of time talking about the need for contingency planning, particularly in the event that it's likely at some point agencies will experience some sort of a interruption in their service or destruction of their resources, and they'll have to recover, they'll have to continue their operations and resume operations in a logical prioritized type manner. And what we found here is that of these 17 of the agencies in 2011 had weaknesses in this area. For 2012, during our initial analysis, it looks like this information will be consistent with what was previously reported and may even be a little bit worse based on what we're currently finding. What we also found from the IGs in our review of the performance and accountability reports is that 21 out of the 24 agencies, or the IGs at those agencies, have identified information security or information system controls as a major management challenge. And this is consistent as it's been for years. GAO has identified this area as a government-wide high-risk area since 1997, and so it remains. Moving on to the next slide, I just want to point out that the number of reported security incidents that have been occurring and reported over the last 5-6 years. Yes, please.
So looking at all those symptoms, and there are a whole host of them, and I agree that they're all there. Oh, I don't need that. My voice carries well enough. Can you guys hear me? Good. So yeah, there are a host of symptoms there. So who has, within the systems development lifecycle, I mean, who or where within the process are these problems, is this an engineering problem? Is it a requirements definition problem? Is it a test and evaluation certification? Is it acquisition? Who has responsibility for plugging all those gaps?
I would say everyone within the organization. Everybody has a security responsibility at some level. But I think you're absolutely right, in terms of being able to assure that the security is developed throughout the life cycle of a system is important. And I'll talk a little bit about it later when I show the screen on the different engagements that we're doing this year. One is at the Federal Communications Commission, and which is implementing and enhancing the security over their network. And we're looking at just that in terms of how these information security risk management activities are being integrated into the system development lifecycle process at that agency. And we haven't yet issued the report, so I can't really talk about the results yet, but it is one that is vitally important to assure that the appropriate security controls are indeed considered early and throughout the life cycle process to assure that they are being implemented, at least designed appropriately, and then tested and reviewed and approved to make sure that and reviewed over time as conditions may change, to make sure that they continue to operate and be implemented as intended. But I think you're absolutely correct in that there are a number of different groups. We talked about it yesterday, or another panel talked about the role for having acquisition folks involved during the acquisition of services or equipment or IT systems. And that's vitally important because in many instances, the security requirements that you receive on an acquired system from external sources is dependent upon what's actually written into the contracts. And so it's going to be important to make sure that the appropriate security requirements are in those contracts. And as an auditor, particularly if we're providing services or we're acquiring services from external parties, that the government and that the auditors have access to the records and to the systems being operated or maintained by those contractors to assure that the appropriate controls, security are in fact being implemented and designed into those systems. So I would say it's, everybody has a role and responsibility from, according to FSMA, from the senior head of the agency who has responsibility throughout to senior program managers who have specific responsibilities within their sphere of influence or their program area, and then down to the CIO and to the CISOs and to the IT shop. It's not just the CIO IT shop issue. It's information security cuts across program areas and should be considered by all those areas. A number of years ago, we made some recommendations to a couple of agencies like VA and I believe IRS too, that they should include information security performance standards or metrics in their performance contracts with their senior executives. And I think Ron Ross mentioned that yesterday as a key thing across all agencies. And that's something that might help raise the level of attention across the federal across the executives at these different agencies. But great question, and thank you for asking it. Any other questions? Okay. Moving on to this next slide, just to reiterate that this basically just shows that the number of security incidents that agencies report to U.S. CERT, which they are required to do, has been increasing over the last several years at a very high level. Even though it seems like it has leveled off between 2010 and 2011, in 2012, those number of incidents have continued to rise to about, I think, a little bit over 48,000. So over the last 6 years or so, that's a 782% increase in the number of reported security incidents. Now that can be for, yes, sir? Sure.
And so are we just getting better at actually seeing the threats, or are there really more threats?
That's an excellent question. The point I was just getting ready to make is it's probably a combination of both, one, better detection capabilities on the part of federal agencies, better reporting on the part of agencies and reporting to the agency or to U.S. CERT, and also increased threats and increased attempts to try to gain access. Indeed, one of the things we'll be looking at, and one of the engagements that we are going to be starting is looking at cyber incident detection and response capabilities at the federal agencies. So we'll be diving into that a little bit more deeper than we have now. This is just an analysis of data that has been reported to U.S. CERT. Yes, please.
Yes, quick question, because this is looking at it from a business perspective. When we go in and try to justify the implementation of it, do you have a correlation between the number of incidents reported and the number of incidents resolved because they are positive versus false negative? But the problem is there something that could show me that? Because if I'm going to go into my business leaders and say, I need X amount of dollars to implement this, I can show you a correlation between incidences that are on the rise and the corrective efforts that we took corrective action on. Is there something that could show me that? Because we know incidents are on the rise. But what about actions taken because of controls implemented?
Right, and that's a good question, and that may be something we look at our upcoming review. But in terms of the data that we have from U.S. CERT, I can't make that statement right now, or that I haven't done that analysis. But certainly, it does, this information can give you additional data in which to show to your budget folks, to your agency, particularly if you're getting hit a number of times. It keeps increasing. We're taking steps to try to identify and take actions to mitigate those particular weaknesses that may allow some of these to occur. And of this chart, what it basically shows, these types of incidents, probably over half of them are those that relate to unauthorized access, malicious code installed on systems, and also improper use of an agency's computer systems. Fully a third, or more than a third, deal with those that are still under investigation. We don't quite know yet, or the agency doesn't quite know what the result or the cause of the particular incident is. Many of these are actually those identified by U.S. CERT through their monitoring of the Einstein systems and the traffic that's I wish I could speak better, that is actually transmitting to and from agencies' networks through the TIC related type of access points. And then actually less than a tenth actually deal with denial of service or other types of scans and programs. And yes, ma'am.
Why would you, what explanation can you give for the small increase between 2010 and 2011? If I were to show this data to my budget person, they would not give me an increase in my budget. They might even decrease it.
Well, this is certainly a conglomeration of all what is being reported by federal agencies. The reason why it leveled off, I can't give you a specific reason other than, potential reasons. It may be a reporting issue, maybe threats leveled off a little bit or particular attempts. Maybe that agencies' reporting thresholds might have changed or so. And so those are things, under the rules set up by U.S. CERT and OMB, agencies are required to report any incident that involves personally identifiable information within, I think, 1 hour or some short period of time. Other types of incidents, there's some discretion, I understand, on the part of the agencies on what they report. But I can't really give you a clear definition of why that occurred. I just can tell you that for 2012, it's continued to increase significantly. And whether it's just a timing of incident or not, but as you see from 2005, 2006, it started increasing significantly. It may be a coincidence or not, but that was also when that VA data theft incident occurred, which really underlined the importance of reporting these types of incidents. And that might have caused, over time, an increase for agencies to report. I thought I saw a line. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I think several things that you hit on. One, this information lacks appropriate context and characterization about what the nature of the incidents are for it to be of truly of value. But if you look at the 2006 timeframe and 2007, which was coincident with 0716 and 0616, which you talked about was the reporting of PIA incidents. since that time, I know, and so we started to have to report everything, and I've had conversations about really, even if someone's filing their taxes or sending their resume around, and it's got umpteen instances of their social security number, does that really constitute a reportable incident? And the answer is, yeah, unless you decide to write your own criteria and say, no, it's not. I had conversations with Earl and DHS, and it's kind of like, well, talk to your solicitor's office, and hopefully they'll figure it out. So there is some gray area about, we're erring on the side of reporting because we don't want to be beat up by the IG or anybody else later that says, no, you didn't report that, So, no, I think that needs to be resolved at the higher federal level. But then we had the evolution. I bet many agencies made the investments in DLP solutions and perimeter gateways and things like that, which probably accounted for greater detection and greater reporting now because, like we invested in the monitoring capabilities, but not the prevention capabilities initially. So our incidents skyrocketed, but we still had to report that we couldn't really contain those that were legitimate incidents. But then we finally invested and used that to support the business case and invest in the prevention piece, which we have now. But I think maybe the leveling off is now that maybe people have the DLP type of capabilities and they know what the true, is of that kind of stuff. And so I would expect it to stay fairly level at this point for those agencies that made those investments.
Well, that's why I think it's important to show from both dimensions. You show the number of reports. We've gotten better at reporting identification and detection. But what's the relationship between that and the corrective, the type of controls that we're implementing to correct is something that I would need.
And for the vast majority of those are really PII incidents where whether their employee stuff or if your mitigation was, well, you have a prevention system now, even though you're aware of it, but you stopped it. Should you have even opened up a ticket in the first place?
Right. Yeah, and that's, in terms of what CERT has reported from I think it was from fiscal year 10 to 2011, the number of those incidents that involve PII, I think increased from 11,000 to around 13,500 or something like that. But there are the delta between those and the numbers here are due to other reasons why they were reporting it. But, very good questions. And indeed, that the actual, it's very hard to specify what the actual reasons are for the increases such as they are, because in some respects, you don't know what you don't know anyway. There could be a number of incidents that are occurring that are not being detected either. So it's very difficult to come up with a precise number on the actual incidents that are occurring at federal agencies. What we can report is what agencies are reporting, and that's the data that we get from through US CERT. So just moving on then, what I wanted to do is just kind of go through briefly some of the weaknesses that we frequently identify during our information security reviews. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key areas we look at are those protections surrounding the boundaries, if you will, of an agency's computing environment, the firewalls, switches, routers, and those types of devices that help restrict access coming in and through to the system or to the networks. And what we often found is that they are not sufficiently controlled. For example, in many cases, either the access control lists may not have been applied on certain key devices. In other cases, those control lists may allow a lot of potentially insecure or inappropriate traffic to transit through those devices. We also found, for example, instances where there may have been interconnections with other networks, either external or internal, that were unintended. And so those are types of weaknesses that could potentially allow additional attack vectors for individual threats. In addition, we often found and I shouldn't say, when I say often, I mean we find at agencies. It's not that it's going to be 100% of the devices we look at or systems, but we typically find at a review that agencies, while they do have identification authentication controls, many of them are using passwords and different types of techniques. We find that a lot of times those passwords are relatively easy to crack. They're not very complex. And often the ones we look at are those that generally have the least secure type of passwords are those individuals like system administrators, those that have the most significant security controls and are security and in system administration responsibilities and access privileges. And so that's kind of a concern. Now agencies are supposed to be moving more towards PIV cards and DoD CAC cards. We recently issued a report, I think a year ago, that showed that many agencies have issued these PIV cards to their individuals within the organizations and to their contractors, their progress is relatively limited to the extent that they have implement the electronic features of those cards to control system access. And we believe that as those cards are being more fully integrated into the environment, that will help to solve some of the issues we're identifying with weak password controls. Also, what we find in this area is that agencies sometimes forget or do not change or delete vendor-supplied password and user IDs. These are those passwords that come with software or operating systems that allow individuals or allow the system administrators to install and bring up the system within their environment. They should be changed. They should be deleted upon installation. And sometimes agencies just forget to do that. And that's another type of issue that we find as it relates to identification and authentication. Another area is the principle of least privilege, making sure that individuals only have the level of access necessary to prevent or to perform their own job-related responsibilities. We often find instances, particularly in databases and with the access controls over databases, where users are giving much access to all the data to either write, read, update the data, when generally they don't need that level of access. We also find in many instances, in some cases hundreds or even thousands of incidents where the accounts are separated employees or for those training accounts for which are not assigned to a specific individual have not been deleted or disabled. And that too potentially can provide an access point for someone to further or escalate their privileges within an organization. It's a network environment. Another area with that too is we often find that, particularly among administrators, that they share user accounts and accounts to perform activities. So that helps diminish the effectiveness of having individual accountability controls. In addition, logging and monitoring issues have raised up in terms of either not logging key security events or logging them but not regularly monitoring them. In addition, the monitoring not just over security or systems activities, but also monitoring the system configurations, the assets on the network, as well as different vulnerabilities that may affect those particular devices, still is not being done on a regular basis. And I know this is one of the priorities of the administration, is to improve that area. I mentioned earlier about physical security controls expose these IT resources to potential accidental or malicious damage. We found instances where we would go to a highly secure computing center and find doors propped open by a chair to allow so people can take smoke breaks and the like. In one case, even though this is individually based, we found keys that were left in the lock to such a door. But often we find that the controls over guards, gates, and guns were not being effectively implemented, and guards weren't actually reviewing or assuring that those individuals gaining physical access were appropriate in checking IDs, for example. Unapplied patches, outdated software, often find that in just about any environment, and these would be critical patches that are intended to mitigate or at least try to correct serious security vulnerabilities. And then we often find that the contingency plans, if many agencies generally have them for their systems, they don't always test them, or if they test them, they don't always take actions to update them, and if they do test them, often it's a limited tabletop type of exercise rather than actually looking and going to an alternate site to see if they could bring up their systems if the primary site is no longer available. Some of the key security practices that we have identified and made recommendations to include separating or segmenting networks so that data with differing levels of security, for example, those data requiring high level of protections, is separated from those data that do not. In addition, to have separate networks for out-of-band, in-band type of management of network resources is one that we often make recommendations to. Implement access control lists. I mentioned that earlier as being an impediment to strong security. Other ones that I just kind of point out here is also just limiting the access to bona fide needs, particularly as it relates to databases and the use of various different tools for that individuals use to perform their responsibilities. Patches, installing the patches in a timely manner is also key because there have been several studies that have shown that, as I think Dr. Ross mentioned yesterday, between 80-90% of most successful security break-ins or incidents occur because basic computer security hygiene has not been performed. So it's important to keep those types of activities performed and done in a timely manner. Additional key practices include providing role-based training for those with significant security responsibilities. Yes? Sure.
One of the big things that the administration is also pushing and a lot of government agencies are having to deal with is BYOD. So I just wonder what kind of a target-rich environment is that going to be for an audit?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's something that we, is one of the trends going towards more mobile devices, whether it's BYOD or just the mobility of the iPads and moving information from within, the boundaries, if you will, of an agency's information security or systems to that on these other devices. Certainly, that creates some additional security risks that need to be considered by those agencies as they embark or intend to use a BYOD type of environment. I'm not sure yet the extent to which that has happened yet in the federal government in terms of agencies that are actually allowing BYOD. We had a conversation at our table last night for dinner where we thought there might have been a couple of pilot programs underway, but so far there hasn't been, as far as I know, any large-scale movement to that yet. They're still kind of waiting and seeing and how to address that. And that's one of the issues with technology and the emerging technologies that we are allowed and able to use in our environments, is that often the technology outpaces the policy as it relates to their use and certainly as it relates to security. So that will certainly introduce risk. And agencies will be well advised to really assess that risk and try to mitigate it to the extent they can, or at least to an acceptable level, in order to, before going full bore into that. But at the same time, security isn't always just about saying no. It's also about saying how well we can use these new technologies, gain the productivity gains, while still managing risk. And it's not risk avoidance, it's managing risk. But thank you, good question. Another key area that we often find, just in terms of assuring that agencies, as they go out and assess the security controls that they have in place, as they identify vulnerabilities, as their auditors identify vulnerabilities, that they act on it. And even though you're going to have great continuous monitoring programs and the like, if that provides additional visibility, but if you don't act on that visibility, you may not be improving your security by as much as it could be. And one thing we often find, too, when we go back and look at the follow-up actions an agency performs in response to our recommendations, they'll say, oh, yeah, we corrected this issue. We took steps. But then when we go out and look at it, we find that the conditions still exist. And a lot of times they may close recommendations just because they have a plan to close it. And so it's important for agencies to follow through on those plans and actually verify that they've addressed the vulnerability and that they effectively addressed it. Moving on, I know that Earl, Crane, and others talked about the three priorities for enhancing security: continuous monitoring, the strong authentication with the PIV cards. I think the stronger authentication process is going to really help on at least resolve some of the findings that we typically identify at agencies. The continuous monitoring effort, and I just talked about that in terms of being able to act on what is being identified. But those types of controls and new business procedures and technologies will also be a very informative and will provide auditors with new information that we can use to evaluate agency's information security program. In some respects, it's going to require us also to modify our audit procedures so we can use that. But one thing with the information that comes out of these continuous monitoring programs, we're going to need to assess whether or not that data is reliable and whether it's accurate, timely, and complete. And so there will be procedures where auditors will need to look at those monitoring capabilities, the extent they're being used within an organization, and then be able to assess that in terms of what type of information is useful for an audit perspective, as well as for monitoring and managing that the agency does as far as their security controls. Other type of trends that will also affect the way we audit agencies' information security programs include the continuing migration to cloud computing and also the increasing use of mobile devices. What this does is basically extend information outside the boundaries of an agency's computing environment. And so as auditors and as agencies, you're going to have to consider those risks and how we're going to protect our information as it escapes our control and physical custody. And that will require not only agencies taking a look and auditors going from kind of a system-centric type of review, if you will, in paradigm, to one which is more information-based. And there are different controls that will be necessary to help protect that information as it's out of the individual agency's computing environment. This is just a one-pager, if you will, of the engagements that we currently have underway or planned for fiscal year 2013. Several of those are related to the FSMA, if you will. We are responsible for conducting a man every 2 years or periodically to identify and address agencies' information security programs, the effectiveness of those programs, and compliance with the provisions of the Act. We will do that this year. In addition, we've been requested by the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to look at the security programs at small, micro, and independent agencies. There's always been a lot of attention given to the major agencies. OMB requires major agencies to report under FSMA on a regular annual basis. They report to Congress on the 24 CFO Act agencies. But there hasn't been given a whole lot of visibilities over these smaller agencies. And so Congress, at least the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, is interested to the extent that the security and privacy controls at those agencies and the level that DHS helps assist and provides support to those agencies. We're reviewing the information security controls at the Census Bureau and National Mediation Board. I've already talked about the project that we're examining at the Federal Communications Commission. And we also have a couple of requests looking at how agencies are assessing their cyber risk management, assessing their risk, selecting the controls that they intend to implement to mitigate that risk, as well as also, again, DHS and their support in those activities to those agencies. Similarly, with the high-impact systems, we'll be looking at the cybersecurity and privacy threats to high-impact systems across the federal space, as well as then the controls and actions and the effectiveness of those actions in protecting those systems. We also do have a number of different issues that we're looking at. As I mentioned at the outset of this presentation, just about all of our work is requested by Congress or mandated by law. The one exception that we have right now to that is this one on cybersecurity strategies. We're looking at the different cybersecurity strategies that have been proposed and implemented over the years as it relates to and trying to improve information security within the federal space. And that's something we'll be issuing in January, where we look at some of the different strategies, how they compare to characteristics or desirable characteristics of national strategies, and then also identifying those challenges which are necessary, or still exist actually, in securing the federal information space. Yes?
Just real quick, I just had it's a very brief question, but it's obviously a very large one. So I see what you're saying here in terms of the cybersecurity audits, right? And you're auditing cybersecurity, and yet Dr. Ross yesterday was talking about how we moved from just looking at IT budgets and cyber toward mission. Do you really see a trend maybe coming more in the GAO's office, because we're seeing it sometimes at the mission level about spending, right? In other words, why does it cost so much, or why is this problem occurring, theft or whatever it happens to be?
Right.
And the one I think that really struck me was when you said it always costs more after the fact. And so my question is,
Can cost more after the fact, right.
Can cost more after the fact, right? So the question I guess I have is there a trend in the GAO's office to really try to integrate this cyber and security auditing as a part of all the other audits that are occurring more at the mission level in terms of the spending and other things? I'm just curious whether that conversion is happening,
I think that's one area we could probably do better on. You know, we have another team within my group, or in the information technology teams, that look at the acquisition and development of major information systems. And I know as part of that review, they do look at least the extent to which agencies are considering security. But those reviews typically focus on, schedule, cost, and performance of those acquisitions.
and it's all IT related?
Right. It's generally IT related. Security is a part of that. The extent that that's a focal point of those reviews, I don't really know, because we haven't been involved, but that's something that should be.
From industry, right?
Right.
So the question we always get asked is, well, okay, your thing costs this much. What does that save me in terms of dollars on the back end? And really, we look at GAO reports many, many times trying to find this.
Yeah.
It's hard to find.
Yeah, and we probably haven't addressed that because it's very difficult to be able to show what the costs are on the back end. There's some limited circumstances where you can. For example, when a security incident does occur, you can kind of calculate what the costs were to resolve that particular issue. We were talking last night about this with the VA data theft incident back in 2006. There was testimony at a couple different hearings that it basically cost, I think like $100, $250, or $100 per individual. You multiply that by 26 million individuals, that's a big number. And that's just for one incident. I see I am out of time, and that's why I'm very glad that we were able to discuss your questions throughout this particular presentation, because I do want to make sure I'm meeting your needs. If you have any additional questions, by all means, come up and see me afterwards or throughout the next day or so, and I'll be happy to discuss those with you. So thank you very much. You've been great.